My name is Dr. Nick Mann. I'm a local GP. I was working up the road in Wells Street Surgery for 16 years. We're here to try to save the St Leonard's Hospital in its entirety for NHS services and not allow portions of this small site to be sold for housing or for retail or for other private sector purposes. There is a hospital standing on that site for nearly 250 years, and since 1984 there have been few services, but very valued services to the Hackney community. Most of the hospital is lying dilapidated and empty, and it's really urgent in the current state of the NHS and the current lack of infrastructure for the NHS that we preserve and maintain every piece of NHS land for NHS purposes. Once sold, it can't be rebought. It's the most precious asset the NHS has. As things stand at the moment, there is no money from central government for any redevelopment at St Leonard's. The government are telling us that we have to find the money by a partial sell-off of the land to provide any services to balance the cost. This is likely to prove financially impossible, but it's also a mistaken venture. Once the private sector owns NHS land, that never comes back. The NHS provides services without fear or favour, and we can't afford to let more of our land be sold off for private sector housing, for retail therapy, or anything else that will benefit the private sector but will again drain the resources of the NHS. It's very likely that it's not the Tory government we need to talk to, because we know that they are not listening. They will provide nothing. So we need to talk to a prospective Labour government, because by the end of next year we may have a Labour government. And it's the Labour government we need to restore the values of the NHS in order to provide a health service which can span another 70 years, 240 years, 300 years. There is no reason why we should imagine that the health service won't be needed in that time. And the most cost-effective way to provide the health service is with a state-provided, publicly funded, publicly provided service. As the private sector are taking over more and more infrastructure and more services in the NHS itself is becoming depleted. With every pound that goes to the private sector, there is a pound lost to the NHS, and those pounds never come back again. They go to furnish shareholders' profits. We need the land, we need St Leonard's Hospital and all the potential services that could provide. We need mental health care services to be provided locally and comprehensively. As things stand at the moment, our mental health care services for older people are in Mile End, and they're moving out to East Ham. That's not an improvement of services for those people or their families who are forced to travel miles and for hours to visit them. A patient I looked after, her husband was unfortunately had to be put into a nursing home, and she was unable to visit him because he was out of borough. She could visit him once every 2 weeks because that's all she could afford to pay for a cab. There was no other way for her to see him. This couple had been married for 70 years, were separated because of the displacement of local services. and for no other reason. 2 lonely people. Magnify that by all the people that will be using these services out of borough. What we will be doing is isolating elderly people instead of caring for them. What elderly people need are their families, their contacts, regular recognition of the lives that they've lived, not isolation in a very plush unit 15 miles away, which nobody can reach. The services that have been provided at St Leonard's so far are very valuable and used frequently by the community. If things don't change, we could lose those as well. It's very clear that the St Leonard's site, which is owned by NHS Property Services, is ultimately destined for sell-off under a Tory government. No question. We need to save that site, and we need to find the money to be able to develop it. It is utterly impossible for that money to be found locally from the integrated care system. It's utterly essential that councillors realise that this is being replicated across the country, and that development of NHS hospitals and other infrastructure should be provided centrally by the state. The state has always provided our hospitals, and to imagine that Hackney can build its own hospital is actually condemning us to be without a hospital. We need Hackney Council to join with other councils and to lobby central government for the funding that is necessary to support the infrastructure which Hackney and the whole integrated care system depends on.